Welcome to our discussion on the attacks on Saudi Arabia oil infrastructure that took place. My name is Mary Chapman. I am Manager of Client Communications at WorldAware. I will be your moderator for the briefing. I would now like to introduce Fahim Masoud, Regional Intelligence Manager for the Middle East and North Africa. Fahim is a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis, where he studied history and politics. Fahim is also an Army Intelligence Officer in the Illinois Army National Guard and formerly worked as a linguist and cultural advisor for the United States Army in Afghanistan. He's going to brief us today on the attacks and their significance for the region. Fahim?
Thank you, Mary. Good morning and good afternoon. I would like to answer some of the questions that our clients have been asking us in recent days, following, of course, the attacks of September 14 in Saudi Arabia. Those questions are: what happened, the significance and the implications of the strikes, the motive, and also the immediate and long-term impacts of the attacks. Please keep in mind that this is an evolving situation and the origins of the attacks have yet to be determined. The Saudis have launched an investigation, and hopefully in the next few days we'll find out what happened and who was behind the attacks. As of right now, US officials maintain that the attacks originated from southern Iran and that the reason the Saudi air defenses did not stop the drones and missiles was because they were pointed southwards, mainly to stop any incoming projectiles from Yemen. I'd like to start off by saying that Yemeni al-Houthi rebels have regularly, obviously, conducted drone and missile attacks against Saudi transportation hubs, shopping malls, and critical infrastructure throughout the country. However, the September 14 attacks are the most serious attacks to have taken place on Saudi soil. These attacks, we believe, are significant on many levels. Of particular significance is if the perpetrators of these attacks could target Aramco's most important oil facilities with such precision and sophistication. Are there any targets or locations inside the kingdom that are immune from such attacks? I would like to also point out that the other significance of the attacks and the symbolism involved here is that Aramco is not an ordinary company. It's a corporation essentially with a country. An attack against Aramco's largest oil facility is a serious blow to the Saudi morale and demonstrates that any and every location within Saudi Arabia is a legitimate target. To the dismay of Americans, the Saudis have reportedly called these attacks their 9/11, mainly because of their magnitude and the impact. So what happened? A total of 10 drones, possibly a combination of missiles and drones, targeted two major oil installations of the Aramco Energy Company, Abqiq and Khuris, in the early hours of September 14. Abqiq is the country's largest oil processing plant, and it is believed to be the world's largest or most important oil facility. The Abqiq oil plant is located about 65 kilometers southwest of Dammam, the capital of Saudi Arabia's eastern province. Khuris oil field, on the other hand, is about 100 kilometers southwest of Abqiq and is estimated to have reserves of more than 20 billion barrels of oil. These attacks have obviously caused significant damage to Abqiq, which has led to a loss of 5.7 million of barrels a day. The Al-Houthis have claimed responsibility, but have yet to provide any kind of proof of their involvement. The Al-Houthis have also threatened to launch further missile and drone attacks against key Saudi infrastructure throughout the kingdom and have warned foreigners to leave the area of Saturday's attacks. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has blamed Iran directly and has said that the Iranian government has engaged in unprecedented attack on the world's energy supply. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran has of course warned Washington and has said that Iran is capable of striking US assets throughout the region and that it is prepared for a full-blown, full-fledged war. The Saudis have yet to, of course, disclose the perpetrators of the attack, but have already mentioned that the weapons that were used in these attacks were Iranian and that they were still investigating the launch location. The Saudis, however, have said that the origins of these attacks are not in Yemen. The question is, if the attacks were not launched from Yemen, where did they come from? One possible place is southern Iraq. In June of this year, US officials concluded that the drone attacks against the Saudi East-West pipeline in mid-May originated from southern Iraq. If it does turn out that the recent attacks came from southern Iraq, the implication is that the Iranian proxies and Iranian-backed militias are attempting to set up new avenues, new platforms to strike Saudi Arabia and Iran's other geopolitical rivals and adversaries. If Iranian-backed Iraqi Shia militias are responsible, it highlights that it really highlights the growing pervasive threat of Iranian influence throughout the region. However, it's unlikely that Saudi Arabia will conduct any retaliatory strikes against the Shia militias in Iraq for a number of reasons. Saudi Arabia is, number one, in the midst of strengthening relations with Iraq in an attempt to gain influence after years of being absent from the Iraqi political scene. Saudi strikes will likely further push the Iraqi government toward Iran and be viewed as an aggressive action. If the Saudi investigation reveals that Iran was responsible for the attacks, it will mark a major shift in the Saudi-Iranian regional rivalry, and the threat of a direct war will also have increased. But without having the full US cooperation, Saudi Arabia is unlikely to take major action against Iran at this point in time. Saudi Arabia's options to respond to the attack remains primarily limited to the ongoing Saudi-Iranian proxy conflict in Yemen. Neither the Saudis nor the Iranians at this point want a direct conflict. And Saudi Arabia, in the event of a conflict, has far more to lose than Iran. This is primarily because Iran has a stronger army and military capabilities than the kingdom does. If the Al-Houthis in Yemen were responsible, it demonstrates how after 5 years of the conflict, their military and technological capabilities have increased. The issue is that there is no other way to prove this other than the openly available satellite imagery showing the accuracy and transparent sophisticated technology required really to have conducted the September 14 attacks. It's clear that these attacks involved Iran in some form or shape. The precision and sophistication involved in the attacks suggests that if the Al-Houthi rebel group was behind the attacks, they had significant help from Iran. It's almost impossible for the attacks to have taken place without at least the knowledge of the Iranian government. If this is the case, the question is why? What is the motivation or motive behind the attacks? Well, the US government and its allies have been imposing severe economic sanctions on a series of Iranian industries, particularly the oil industry. Iran is a country, like Saudi Arabia, that heavily relies on its oil exports. Absent oil exports, the Iranian government could face social unrest in the form of demonstrations throughout the country. Understanding this, the Iranian government has said that if Iran cannot export oil, no other country can. The attacks of September 14 are essentially an attempt by the Iranian government to demonstrate that, one, it can strike back, and that it can destabilize the region and cause significant disruptions to the international oil markets. The success of the attacks have also exposed vulnerabilities in Saudi Arabia's defense capabilities. Furthermore, the attacks suggest that either the Al-Houthis have increased military capabilities or that Iran and its allies are becoming more brazen in terms of achieving their regional agendas. The immediate impact of the attacks is obviously a reduction in global crude oil production and an increase in global oil prices. Oil accounts for 70% of Saudi Arabia's export revenues and over half of the country's GDP, marking recovery a dire issue both for the country's economic livelihood and political stability. While the US, of course, continues to attribute the attacks to Iran, it's possible that Saudi Arabia will ultimately blame the Al-Houthis as a face-saving measure, and it will also increase aerial bombardment of the rebels in Yemen. Whether the attacks originated in Yemen, Iraq, or Iran, both the US and Saudi Arabia will regard it as part of this wider regional struggle with Tehran. In terms of the attacks' impact on the regional security environment, Iran is likely to continue its policy of vessel seizures, and drone attacks will likely increase within the kingdom because of the country's vulnerabilities, again, have been exposed now. Direct conflicts at this point in time between Iran and Saudi Arabia is unlikely due to uncertainty regarding the extent of US support, and US security guarantees are and have been defensive in nature and do not extend to cover unilateral Saudi offensive maneuvers unless strategic goals are aligned at that point in time. The US is unlikely to back unilateral Saudi military action against Iran, but it will almost certainly support the kingdom once hostilities are underway. The long-term impact of the attack is largely really contingent upon who is ultimately found responsible. Mary, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fahim. Next, we'll be hearing from Tony Roccaforte, Senior Security Consultant for Global Assistance and Response. Prior to joining our Global Assistance and Response team, Tony was a Senior Intelligence Analyst at WorldAware focused on political violence and armed conflict. Tony is going to talk about the impact to organizations in the region and how to prepare. Tony?
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to Fahim too. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to talk a bit about risk mitigation measures in light of these attacks, these reported attacks. With almost every alert that WorldAware publishes, analysts include an advice section for the clients. This advice is intended to give clients impacted by the event clear, actionable guidance for reducing their vulnerabilities. Following these reported drone strikes, WorldAware is advising against unnecessary movement within 40 kilometers or 25 miles of Saudi Arabia's borders with Yemen and Iraq. Some buffer zones are already in place, so access to the immediate border areas is already controlled to a degree, but we also need to consider the known ranges of common indirect fire systems we've seen used in the region. We also want to avoid being too close to the border in the event of a tactical miscalculation on either side, which could obviously inadvertently trigger an escalation. If indirect fire or drone activity is reported in your immediate vicinity, you simply stay indoors, move away from exterior walls and windows, and if possible, move to a lower level. The activity directly on the border, those particular border regions are a bit more restive, but further deeper into the country, a lot of what we're seeing is lower yield devices. We also need to ensure that we have a robust communications plan in place to ensure we can gain accountability of our people when events like this do occur. Our communication plans should incorporate multiple forms of communications. Obviously, local cell networks and radio platforms spanning multiple frequency bands should serve as the primary and alternate methods of communication. However, in areas without network coverage or in areas that are beyond the range of relay stations, or if certain communication frequencies are jammed, a satellite phone or a two-way GPS messaging device may be your only option. We also need to make sure we're staying well informed of any significant developments, liaise with WorldAware through the Access to Analyst program, but also liaise with local contacts to ensure you have the most up-to-date information as the situation unfolds. Additionally, we always verify onward transportation before checking out of your accommodations. Finally, we need to brace for an increased security posture in the region, not just along the border, but deeper inside Saudi territory as well. Specifically in Eastern Province, where a large population of Shia minorities reside, the region has been experiencing a low intensity insurgency for quite a while now. And if tensions between Riyadh and Tehran escalate, that could spur the insurgency in that region. If confronted by security forces, ensure that your people are complying with all instructions immediately and do not attempt to bypass a security checkpoint for any reason. Even an accidental breach of the security cordon near a checkpoint may prompt security forces to respond aggressively, possibly with deadly force. If I could, though, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how planning and preparation can also help us mitigate our vulnerabilities and reduce our overall risk. What does it mean to have a successful risk management strategy, right? So success is a tricky word here. It implies there's an end state to a specific, measurable, achievable, and time-bound objective. However, in the context of risk mitigation, it's not so simple. Risk is a continuum, it's never static, meaning preparedness efforts must also be continuous and constantly evolving. As such, one of the only true measures of success with regards to risk mitigation is when readiness and response efforts become integrated components of every organization's core business. When we talk about mitigating risk in the risk management cycle, we're talking about proactive and reactive strategies. Proactive strategies encompass 4 stages: planning, training, and when we talk about training, we're talking about our employees, our travelers, and in some cases, spouses and family members as well. The next stage in a proactive strategy is real-time monitoring of global situations and intelligence analysis. This is, as most clients understand, a 24/7/365 process. And then finally, the event trigger, which serves as the transition point from proactive efforts to reactive ones. Once we transition into reactive mode, we must focus on responding quickly, but not get bogged down in a purely threat-centric response. Let me unpack that just a bit. At WorldAware, we break risk down into 3 factors: threat, vulnerability, and consequence. As risk managers, we can gauge the capability and intent of threat actors and the frequency and magnitude of natural and accidental man-made hazards, but we are rarely in a position to directly mitigate those threats or hazards themselves. However, we do have direct control over our vulnerabilities to those stressors. So if we can mitigate our vulnerabilities, we can minimize cascading effects, i.e. consequences, when risk is inevitably realized. From there, we can focus on business continuity efforts and taking steps to returning our people and operations to normalcy. Individuals and organizations must understand their own risk profile and take steps to mitigate their vulnerabilities. Again, as risk is never static, our risk profiles are changing constantly. Bottom line, planning and preparation should never stop. We do not want to rely on ad hoc mitigation measures. We, you, me, everyone is their own first responders in an emergency or a crisis scenario. So planning and preparation is everyone's responsibility. But as risk managers, we play an extremely vital role in guiding our organization's preparedness strategies. When designing a preparedness strategy, the first step is to gain buy-in from your organization's key leaders. Without genuine support from the executive level, preparedness efforts will be hampered and could derail completely. From there, we need to identify and prioritize our assets, functions, processes, and resources, ensure that all appropriate personnel are aware of their roles and responsibilities in safeguarding those assets and responding to an emergency or crisis, as well as leading recovery efforts following an event. Stakeholders should then conduct a thorough risk assessment using an all perils approach, identifying all relevant threats and hazards facing their assets and gauging each asset's level of vulnerability or exposure to any identified stressor. This risk assessment will aid us in developing and implementing our plans. Ignore the drone strikes in Saudi for a minute and just consider the potential impact of severe shortages of food, water, fuel, medical care, communications, transportation, electricity, and sanitation services, as well as travel bans and curfews on your organization's operations. There are no shortages of stressors that could bring about these conditions. This is what I'm talking about when I say we need to be careful to avoid taking a purely threat-centric approach to risk mitigation. We should avoid gravitating towards the event and instead focus on the circumstances and consequences that could arise should a harmful event occur. So we need to be planning for these contingencies constantly. Yes, the old adage that no plan survives first contact is very applicable here, but it is far better to have a framework in place so we're not relying entirely on ad hoc mitigation techniques. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this WorldAware briefing. For more information on the recent events in Saudi Arabia or to request to speak with someone, visit our website at worldaware.com.